what I can imagine.
Exactly.
Just didn't realize there was a door.
Ah!
I feel like that's the same thing on the state, though.
Yeah, stay hydrated.
They've got, you know, that year for
Oh my gosh.
You know what to say. It's like a collab.
We got stuff.
We got stuff.
Alright, guys. Time to take a nap.
You are completely right. I love it.
I do, colibri, yeah. Colibri, yeah. So word for hummingbird in Spanish.
I would have been.
They really like that. What the?
I guess you it's really sweet. Okay,
That reminds me of something. It's a ringneck joke, just kidding. Yeah, that's it. What is that? Is that
Yes,
a shell
that's
thing?
beautiful.
It's a pigeon. It's a pigeon. That's right. But it looks like a ringneck.
It's
Because
a bird.
they never have a ring on their necks.
Yeah, it's a ringneck.
I thought I recognized that. Pigeon book.
Pigeon book.
There, that's what that
Good afternoon, everybody.
is. Is it?
Welcome.
I'm just kidding. It is. It is. Good.
It's a great day for ornithology.
It is. It is a great day for ornithology. It's always a great day for ornithology because God's gift to humankind was birds
Really?
on so many different levels.
Or did you just make them?
We can enjoy watching them. We can enjoy eating them. You know, the whole gamut. So,
Yeah. I'm not ready.
I will have the conservation report schedule posted before the end of the day today. I had one more little issue with them I had to get resolved, and I have done that. They will be starting after spring break. So you guys need to plan on tackling those, and you will know what day you're going to go. I anticipate that they will take us 2 2/3 lectures because there'll be 8 of them, and that will be cool. I look forward to hearing it. You guys have some interesting topics you've proposed. The one thing that I will encourage all of you to do when you are putting together your reports, you were going to fall through that.
It's broken. It scared me because I started it and it's not attached. I was like, holy crap.
You don't look that heavy. I mean, that's,
I know, right? No, I didn't break it. That would be shocking if I did that.
anyway, and I think I've sent some emails in response to your topic suggesting this. You really want to try to focus in on a specific event as much as you can. If you don't do that, you're going to end up giving a report that is just full of generalities. And I would much rather you look at one specific scenario and dive a little deeper on that. So, for example, one group has proposed to look at microplastics, which is an amazing topic. It really is. It's something that is really starting to explode on the conservation scene. But there are so many places where that is occurring and being studied. You could not possibly do all of it. So I would look for something that's that's a little more targeted than that involves, perhaps microplastics in a specific location, where they've been looking at maybe even a specific species of bird that you can adequately cover in 20 minutes. Okay. Does that make sense? All right. So that's something to think about. So anyway, we will. They're good. They're 20 minutes. We'll do 3 a lecture period because we have 1 hour and 15. That gives us plenty of transition time. And so we'll do 2 full lectures, and then we'll have 2 and 1 and a little bit of me in a third lecture. I fully anticipate getting through the necessary content for exam next week. In fact, I probably will finish it on Thursday, and then even get a head start on the stuff for the final before we bug out for spring break. Okay, do you guys have any questions before I get started? Anything burning on your brains that you just absolutely need me to tell you? Yes, Celia.
Why are ospreys in their own family?
Because no other family would take them.
Oh, shoot. Not even a face of mother to
You know, somebody smarter than I am has been looking at their DNA and decided that it was different enough from everything else that it deserved its own family. That's where it fell out on the cladistic tree. What can I say? Yes.
Can you elaborate a little bit more on what you're wanting for the bird song project, like what you want us to present to you when we email
You, I'm not sure I totally understand your question, but I'll take a crack at it. You are going to do a research project on some aspect of bird song. Okay, so you know, you grab a group, you decide I want to study this species, but it's got to be more than I'm going to study the song of this species. What exactly are you trying to find out with regard to the song of a particular species? Are you going to look at, say, for example, I'm going to explore neighborhood differences between groups of black-capped chickadees, which means you might go and record chickadees in, you know, maybe 3 or 4 different locations, and then you can compare the songs between them, and that would be a perfectly good project. You might want to look at song diversity within a single population, which you could do. So maybe you go out and you record, make a lot of recordings of different chickadees in the same place, maybe do it at different times of days, to see how variable song is and how song maybe changes over the course of a day, to get an idea as to what their repertoire is like. You could, you know, if you are, you know, if you just have good dreams about icterids, you know, every night, and you want to study icterids, you could actually go do a study where you're looking at similarities and differences between different species that are in that family. Does that help you?
Yeah.
Okay. It's something that I would start thinking about, because the end of the semester is going to race up faster than any of us realize, I think. And these, the song reports will be presented during our final period. So, any other questions? All righty, well, let's get cracking. And I will remember to share my screen today. So just an FYI that you can help me, because you actually look at this more than I do. If you never see this little window with, you know, the little picture up in the corner, then you know I'm not sharing my screen. That's a good indication I've discovered. So, all righty. So last time we've been talking about annual cycles. We've been talking about how a major player in driving the timing of events that occurs in annual cycles, photoperiod is probably numero uno. Okay, but it would not be selectively advantageous for any bird to depends solely on precise timing of everything it does over the course of the year, solely based on photoperiod, because photoperiod doesn't change. But when days lengthen, when days shorten, that's going to happen the same every single year. But there are a whole bunch of other things that occur within an environment that need to be considered when a bird is going to start, for example, breeding. All right. So when we look at breeding cycles in birds, they are actually going to be shaped by a whole bunch of different things that kind of fit into this bigger photoperiod umbrella. And these are going to be things like food availability, are there nest sites available? What's the climate like at a particular point in time? What is the risk for predation? Because one of the biggest sources of mortality in birds is nest predation. And all of these things will be used to kind of fine tune the breeding cycle of birds. Now, another thing that birds have to face is all of these factors are going to have the potential to change from year to year. When food becomes available is going to depend on things that are going on with the climate. And these things don't happen exactly the same every year. So some small adjustments are going to have to be made. And if they aren't made, then these birds can really suffer some pretty severe consequences to their fitness, their reproductive success, and even their longevity in some cases. So there are a whole bunch of factors that are going to influence when the gonadal cycle, which basically is when breeding, when they start to get into breeding condition, is going to occur. A big one is temperature. It's certainly not the only one, but temperature is related to climate. And so if the birds are on their breeding grounds and they're starting to ramp up to breeding condition, but let's say the temperature gets really cold all of a sudden, they may slow down their approach to breeding condition to wait for the temperature to warm up a little bit. So most birds have some cues like that will help them fine tune the timing of things that are associated with their annual cycle. Okay. Other things that they will use to influence the precise timing of when things happen might be the presence of certain foods. Okay. And it may be when other members of the population start exhibiting the right kind of social behavior. Okay, if birds have not started singing aggressively yet, maybe that is influencing the rate at which other individuals will approach breeding condition in order to get everybody there at the same time. Okay, and I think we ended with this last time where we showed you this kind of crazy example where pinyon jays actually start their gonadal cycle when these green pine cones start to appear. Now, I mean, you can think about all the things that influence when a green pine cone is going to show up. There's a lot of climatic things that will influence that. So hopefully what you're seeing from this is how the annual cycle is managed in birds can be a really complex thing. Yeah, man.
Yeah, like how does that work? Like, do they just like see green pine cones and like their gonads get big? Like, I don't know,
So,
like-
well, let me ask you a question. Have you ever seen something that you really like and you just start to salivate?
Yeah, like a giant pizza.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay. Why does that happen?
Because I'm hungry.
Well, what I'm saying is, visual cues can have some real powerful physiological effects.
So when they like see it, does it like release?
It's basically a cue that says, okay, the food's coming.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
The food's coming, and so so like the pizza's coming. Okay.
Yeah, all right.
So now I'm ready. So
Okay. Okay.
other questions? All right. So how an annual cycle occurs is going to be dictated by where on this planet the birds happen to be. So if you're a bird and you're in the tropics, breeding seasons actually tend to be quite long. And so they can exceed 6 months, and in some cases, breeding can occur all year. So they're not seasonal events. And this is because, if you're in an equatorial climate, it's pretty constant. Okay, food availability, it does vary a little bit, but overall, what's there is going to be there. But even in the tropic, there is a little fine tuning that can go on, because even in a lot of places in the tropic, they do have sort of dry seasons. So if you're a tropical kingfisher, for example, you time breeding to begin at the end of the dry season, because this is when you can see the fish the best, because the water's the clearest at this point in time. You don't got all this rain washing crud into the water and making the water all murky. Okay. Hummingbirds also, note we're getting our hummingbird reference in early today. They actually will peak towards the start of the dry season, because this is going to be a prime flowering time. So they're going to have a lot of nectar available for energy. They're going to have a lot of small arthropods that are associated with all of that will provide them all the nutrition that they need to engage in a pretty intense breeding season. In temperate climates, such as we have here, breeding seasons are a whole heck of a lot shorter, and often less than 3 months or 4 months, pardon me. And that's because the amount of time over the course of a year where conditions are good for breeding, it's very seasonal. Local populations will fine tune when breeding occurs. So, for example, when breeding occurs, here in the Willamette Valley for birds, will likely be different than where Beth was in Michigan. Okay, because how the seasons occur are different in these two places, and the birds will respond to that. Now, a classic example of local adaptation for the annual cycle and breeding seasons is the brown pelican. Brown pelicans actually occur in many places in the world. And part of this, I think, is because they're the only marine pelican that I'm aware of. But how they conduct their annual cycle really depends on where they are. So if they are at northern latitudes, then they will exhibit a very seasonal nesting pattern. Whereas if they tend to be in more tropical sites, so more equatorial, they don't exhibit any sort of seasonal breeding. So what this illustrates is we don't see, a one-size-fits-all for a species. Really, the annual cycle is driven by where a population of a species lives. So some more about pelicans. If they are in a location where they're experiencing some excessively low water temperatures relative to what they're used to, this generally will reduce food availability. Okay, so this will delay their breeding cycle. Okay, so this is an example. This is another example, a different way in that temperature is influencing when the precise timing of breeding is going to occur. In this case, it's water temperature rather than air temperature. If you're one of these tropical populations where you're getting subjected to hurricanes a lot, then breeding is very irregular because they literally will time breeding between these hurricane events. And one of the things that you will learn, as we progress through today, as we get to the end of this particular chapter, and even when we start talking about migration in the next chapter, is that birds are amazing weathermen and women. They have this uncanny ability to predict the weather. And they know when it's coming. And we don't really know a whole lot about how they do that. Here is a table from your text that illustrates just the variety that we see in brown pelican breeding activity. The thick portion of the bars here are when you actually have eggs in the nest, and you can see that it's kind of all over the planet, depending on where they are. And they range in latitude from, 10 all the way up to 35, at least in terms of where these things were measured. So again, it's a single species that clearly has the capacity to alter its annual cycle or adapt its annual cycle to what works best for where they live. Questions? Okay, we've talked a lot, probably we beat a dead horse with this, about how precisely birds can time things. And this includes migratory activity as well. They can really precisely time, when they leave, when they arrive. In fact, I'll give you an example in a bit about, one place that actually holds a festival because the birds are so precise in their timing of when they show up. Okay. Internal rhythms are responsible for this, and as we've mentioned multiple times, the big player in this is going to be photoperiod. I think we talked about this last time or the time before, but even a caged migratory bird, as long as it's subjected to the proper cues, will experience migratory restlessness, this Zuganru that we talked about before. And that's because, they are genetically programmed to prepare themselves to migrate. And I'll even show you an example a little bit later in studies of captive white-crowned sparrows, where every year they fatten up for migration, even though they're not allowed to migrate because they're captive, because they're subjected to all of the right cues. And genetically, that's just what they're designed to do. Non-migratory birds do not exhibit Zuganru. The internal cycles are always going to be messing around with the endocrine system. So all of the physiological response is going to be hormonally based. We don't have a really good understanding of what drives Zuganru. Some work on white-crowned sparrows have suggested maybe some adrenal cortical hormones, so maybe it's another one of those court things. Prolactin perhaps is involved with this, but we really don't have a great understanding of the endocrinology behind what drives this migratory restlessness. In winter, the spring restlessness is going to be driven by increasing day lengths, and this will result in hyperphagia. So in other words, they're going to start eating like crazy because they got to build up fat for migration. And I think we mentioned before that migratory birds will increase in mass, sometimes double their mass just by storing fat. A couple of classic studies that have illustrated the link between increasing day length and fat deposition. There was an old study done by Wolfson in the 1940s on dark-eyed juncos, and they just showed that when day length increased, they just started storing fat, but non-migratory juncos did not do this. So here's an example of a species where we have some migratory individuals, some non-migratory individuals, but only the migratory ones are responding to this increasing day length. Here's the example I was telling you about, captive white-crowned sparrows. When it came time for migration, for spring migration, they just started depositing fat, even though, and they did this for 8 consecutive years, even though they weren't migrating because they were captive. Okay, so they just have this precise internal clock that says this is what you need to do right now. Questions? Anything? What goes on here, doesn't it? Here's an interesting study I found a few years ago. I mentioned a few moments ago that we really don't understand the endocrinology that's associated with migratory restlessness. But Fusani and colleagues back in 2014 published a study on blackcaps where they linked migratory restlessness, Zugenrue, to the deposition of these chemicals called cryptochromes. They're flavoproteins, and flavoproteins are just proteins with some derivative of riboflavin attached to them. They do a whole bunch of physiological things. But this particular one is light sensitive. And focus on these graphs right here. This open bars right here represent migratory individuals. And you can just see the expression of these cryptochromes in their retina goes through the roof. And these cryptochromes provide them the ability to be sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. And when we get to the next chapter and talk about migration, we'll talk about how the geomagnetic compass is a big player for birds in migration. And so this was a little different take on what potentially could be driving Zugenrue. And of course, flavoproteins can be tickling the endocrine system as well. So. Okay, timing. Fall migration. This is really interesting. Fall migration actually is influenced by spring activities. And I find this really fascinating. So when birds are getting ready to undergo their fall migration, they found in white-crowned sparrows have been studied a lot. In white-crowned sparrows, all of the things that you would expect in preparing you for winter. Okay, your reduction in testes, the pre-basic molt, and preparations for migration, all of this depended on prior exposure to long photoperiods. So in other words, things that happened to you historically, it was important that you got exposed to those things in order to go through the normal physiological preparation for winter. Okay. So you thought it was complex before, now it's even more complex. Okay. However, the current photoperiod does influence this because the rate at which these things occur, testes reduction and so forth, okay, your pre-basic molt, all of those are influenced by shortening days. So wrap your head around that one. Okay. This just reiterates a point that I made earlier. Timing of migration, and it doesn't matter whether we're talking spring or fall, it is going to be a function of internal rhythms, but the timing can be fine-tuned by other things such as weather factors. So intrinsic factors, and these can be things like temperature, barometric pressure is a big one, wind, any of these environmental factors can be used to fine tune the timing of migratory events by birds. So as I mentioned, birds are really good at forecasting weather. And we know that birds are really sensitive to pressure changes. But again, this is probably not the only one, but it is a big one. And how birds are sensitive to pressure, we really don't know. It's a real hard thing to study. Trying to create a laboratory environment where you're subjecting a bird to the types of natural pressure changes that it would experience in the wild is just a ridiculously hard thing to do. There have been a few studies, though. Metcalf and colleagues in 2013 found in white-crowned sparrows, so again, white-crowned sparrows are kind of the star of a lot of these studies, that that wintering birds responded to decrease in barometric pressure by increasing basically Zugenrue. So when barometric pressure decreases, that's generally a sign that bad weather is about to pounce upon you. They all of a sudden just came into migratory condition, basically thinking like, I got to get out of Dodge. Okay, and you can see that here. So latency to move, latency to feed. So basically they're feeding really fast, they're moving really fast. Movements per minute, feeds per minute. Everything with a star on it here is related to low pressure situation. The birds are ramping their activity up. Okay, these are wintering birds. Okay, so they're getting ready. So they're getting ready to head up to their breeding grounds. Now, an interesting thing though, and so I'm going to ask you a question about this in a moment. When we look at birds coming the other way, birds preparing to return to their wintering grounds, pressure doesn't seem to have any impact on their migratory condition. Does that make sense to you? Michelle, does that make sense to you?
Don't know.
Think about it. Think about it for a second. So, you know, if you're a bird that is getting ready to go off to your breeding grounds, okay, and the weather is going to turn bad, and just to give you a little teaser information for the next chapter. The only reason that birds migrate, it's because things are better in the breeding ground than they are where you're at. And so if you get a decrease in pressure, that is telling you, okay, things are not so good here. I gotta move. Okay. It makes sense that pressure is going to be a primary cue for you to fine-tune the timing of departure. When you're departing from your breeding grounds, and for most birds, at least New World birds, that will always be north of your wintering grounds. You know, you're breeding during the spring, maybe during a portion of the summer, and the normal timing of migration to exit is, probably late summer, maybe really early fall for some species. Do you think it's important that they're sensitive to pressure on that return trip to their wintering grounds? Zach, what do you think?
Well, if it's like the weather is bad coming back, maybe they would stay breeding grounds for longer.
Yeah, actually, you know what's really interesting for the return trip, what they actually found is that temperature was probably a bigger factor than pressure was for them. Evan, what do you think?
Is it location based? Like that's where they made their nest and their home, so they kind of just know where to go when the temperature starts getting bad in the breeding ground?
Well, they probably know where to go regardless of which direction they're going. That would be pretty important. Molly, should I pick on you?
Is it because the weather going back, because it is late summer, late fall, it's not really gonna be that bad in comparison to leaving?
If I were going to speculate about it, that's exactly what I would think, is that there probably has been not been huge selective pressure for these species to really be tuned in to pressure, because in most cases where they're at, the kinds of, that they're not going to be dealing with the kinds of storms that would be reflected by a lot of major drops in pressure. That would be my speculation. I don't think that I don't think you could say for sure why or why not. I think temperature is probably a better reflection of helping them understand, how the seasons are transitioning rather than pressure changes. But, if you're getting a lot of weather patterns from your wintering grounds, they're probably subject more to some of these weather patterns that would be reflected by decreases in pressure. That would be my guess. But clearly, again, there's just a lot going on as the birds, these little things with feathers on them are considering what their next move is going to be. Okay. Let's move on to migration and navigation, chapter 10. So we'll get through migration today, and when I get through migration today, if I get done a little early, we'll see. We'll stop early because I think I want to cover navigation in one fell swoop, and I'll do that, and I will do that on Thursday. Navigation is just really, really fascinating. But migration is a major undertaking for birds. Okay. Every fall, roughly 5 billion birds migrate in Europe and Asia. Okay. And they generally are heading to Africa. All right. In the New World, North America, same basic thing. We have about the same number of birds that are going to leave North America and go down to Central, South America, Mexico, wherever they're going. But major number of birds are traveling. And the key reason why birds migrate is because it allows them to exist in locations where they can stay active the entire year without having to use a lot of these mammalian strategies such as hibernation. Okay? It allows them to avoid being subject to extreme climates. Okay. Now, of course, not all birds migrate. Okay. Because migration, it's not a free lunch for birds. It's very costly. In fact, and I'll give you these proportions a couple of times today. Roughly 50 to 60% of adult birds that start migration don't make it. So mortality during migration is really, really high. And so there must be some benefit to it. Okay. Also, migratory species are often the focus of many conservation efforts because habitat destruction at either end of the migration can impact the species. So it's sort of like a double whammy. Okay, so this map over here on the right of the screen illustrates the major migration routes through North America. Notice that they are all pretty much north-south. In the New World migrations, they pretty much go straight north-south, okay? And part of this is because when you look at our coastlines, our major mountain ranges, they're all oriented north-south. So it makes it a pretty easy, and also major rivers for that matter. It makes it pretty easy for migratory pathways to orient in those directions. Now, when we look at Europe, it's a little bit more complex than that. For most species, and I can't even think of an exception to this, winter ranges are south of the breeding ranges. That's because it's warmer. Old World birds. This bullet point probably could be worded a little bit better, but Old World birds often have a substantial east-west component to their migrations, even though ultimately the migrations still have a north-south orientation. And this is because a lot of their major ecological barriers and landmarks and such have an east-west orientation. Now, sometimes you'll get species that will expand their range and start inhabiting new places. And one of the things that has been noted when these species have been studied is that a species will generally stick to its historic migratory route, regardless of if it range expands or not. And this here is a pectoral sandpiper, and it's a pretty classic example of this. So pectoral sandpipers, which migrate up to Alaska, they've ended up colonizing Siberia. And it would seem that a logical thing for them to do would be to migrate down that Asian coast. But they don't do that. They come back up into Alaska and migrate to South America. Okay.
Tradition.
Huh?
Tradition.
Yeah, tradition. There you go. Okay. And so that's just, you know, and so what this tells you is that there is a certain degree of genetic programming that is associated with these routes. Yes.
This isn't relevant to the slide, but I was just gonna ask if the handout for this chapter will be posted soon, because I couldn't find the handout for it on campus.
Did I not post it?
can't find it.
Humbly apologize.
Um,
I will. Okay, I'm sorry. That's a total me issue.
Okay. just
I
wanted to
will
make
make sure that happens right after class.
sure. Okay, thank you.
Or I can do it now.
Huh?
I can open it now.
No, because I have a certain way of doing it. Yeah, it's not the way that it's on the stuff that they can't see.
Okay.
Yeah, I will do it right. I will do it. And I apologize for that. Keeping up with Canvas this semester is, I'm just one step ahead of it, and I should have thought about it, but I didn't. But you want to know what? I still give you an exciting story here. How about that?
Whoa. Yeah.
Okay, so even without the handout, stopover sites are really important to migratory birds. Okay, notice that segue there. And this is a map from your text which illustrates a lot the major migratory routes that are taken by shorebirds, and shorebirds migrate in huge numbers. And the way that migration works for them, they will actually fly long distances in between stops, but it's really important that they have a place that they can land that's going to have nice mud flats that are going to allow them to probe for food and refuel for the next leg of their migration. And all of these points on the map here represent major stopover points. Now, they're really, when you look at how these are distributed, there really aren't that many of them. And so, you can imagine that of all the shorebirds in the New World, they're all landing at these spots, every single one of them, because that's where they have to go in order to refuel for the next leg of the migration. And so these stopover points for some species like shorebirds are also a hot spot for conservation, because these stopover points often are very near prime places to develop, because they often are coastal or near big bodies of water that are popular recreation areas, whatever. They're very, very popular places to develop. And so often these important stopover points for shorebirds get threatened by human activity. But having these there, and they are predictable, the birds know where they are. You can imagine how difficult it would be for a bird to move from this spot to that spot and not have that spot there anymore. That would be devastating to not just one species, but a variety of species of shorebirds, because a lot of these birds migrate together in groups, pretty huge groups. So we've been talking mostly about migration things, but why migrate? To be honest, if you live in a place where food is going to be abundant year-round, then selection would favor you becoming a resident. Okay. You know, the black-capped chickadee that we mentioned earlier today is a resident species. It doesn't migrate. So it clearly has enough stuff around here that it does not have to risk survivorship in order to engage in a long migration. When migration is important, it's when the resources on your breeding grounds primarily are highly variable, such that, and unpredictable for that matter, such that they cannot reliably support the bird's existence for the entire year, then selection will favor an obligatory annual migration to go someplace where your energetic needs can be met more easily. But again, this does not mean that one size fits all, even for a given species. Within a species, some populations may be migratory and some may not. And this is something that will get genetically embedded into populations. We talked about white-crowned sparrows and the 4 subspecies. 3 of them are migratory, 1 of them is a resident species. Okay. And the resident species in California, there's no need for it to migrate out of California, apparently. Plenty of stuff for it to eat. The common ring plover, this guy right here, is also an example of a species where some populations are migratory and some are not. Mortality during migration is really high, and so the benefits must be high as well. And I'll show you a table in a minute which kind of illustrates the pluses and minuses of the different strategies. But so birds that migrate to the tropics have better survivorship. So this is a thinking question. Have better survivorship during the winter than species that remain in temperate climates because they have to deal with things like snow, okay, and cold temperatures and low food availability. But birds that remain resident in temperate climates tend to have the highest reproductive success. So which is more important? We've got both components of fitness here. Survivorship is better if you migrate to the tropics. But reproductive success is better if you stay put in a temperate environment and stick it out even during cold winters. Which is more important? I hear one reproductive success. So, whose fitness is better? A bird that lives in a temperate environment has one clutch of, let's just say, 6 eggs, produces six offspring, or a migratory individual that produces 1 offspring for 6 consecutive years. Whose fitness is higher? Is there a difference? No, in terms of absolute fitness, it's exactly the same. So which is more important? It's probably not that simple a question. So, the ways to think about this, selection does not always produce the exact same outcome. Okay, selection produces a scenario that works for the species, and so things like body size and a whole bunch of other things that may influence a bird's ability to tolerate one scenario versus another will probably come into play in dictating what's going to be favored for that particular type of a bird. Okay. All right. So here are the three major scenarios for annual cycle for birds. First, tropical resident. Okay, the adult survivorship, annual survivorship is really high, 80 to 90%. Okay, they don't face what you would consider to be a huge amount of predation. They don't have harsh conditions that they got to deal with. You know, they sit in their tree with their little pina colada or whatever it is, you know, they're doing, you know, something with an umbrella coming out of the glass, you know, and just, you know, living the life.
Yeah.
But the environment is constant. They don't have any sort of a seasonally abundant food source. Okay, the food is what it is. It's you know, it's pretty steady eddy. And so reproductive success is actually relatively low. Migrants, okay, they escape the winter. You know, so they're migrating generally to a temperate habitat to reproduce. And so they'll migrate back to the tropics or someplace warmer anyway. Okay. Adult survivorship, moderate, I guess, if you consider 50% moderate. So 50, 60% is, you know, is the mortality rate. So a lot of them still perish as part of migration. But the temperate environments tend to have these explosions of food during the spring that can support a whole bunch of reproduction, sufficient for multiple clutching in many species. And so reproductive success is moderate. A temperate resident, on the other hand, just gets nailed because during the winter, it's just really hard to survive the winter. There's not a lot of food and only so many individuals. There's probably only enough food to support so many individuals. So adult survivorship is really low. It can be as low as 20% in some really harsh places. But they are the first on the breeding grounds during the spring. And so they get access to this explosion of food for an extended period of time. And so they can maximize their reproductive success. So what you can see here is we look at all three of these different strategies, you're futzing with a trade-off between survivorship and reproduction to try to navigate your way to the highest possible fitness that you can achieve. And they don't all do it the same way. All right, questions? Yes.
So it's not like much of a question. So it's kind of like this inverse like relationship, like reproductive success and like survival rate kind of like goes up and down, fluctuates depending on what the bird's goal is.
Well, I mean, the bird's goal is all, I mean,
Yeah.
like any living thing is to maximize fitness.
Yeah, right.
And different species achieve that in different ways.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that you said that there can be variation within populations of the same species for whether they migrate or whether they're a resident, but can the same bird ever go from being a resident to being migratory? Like, do they ever change depending on?
That's a good question, and hold on to that question.
Okay.
Because I will address it in a moment.
Okay.
Me and some sort of bird. So. Anything else? Okay. Migrations can be really, really long. So Arctic terns, okay, this guy right here will migrate 25,000 kilometers round trip. Okay, from the south, it goes up one coast, then from the north comes down coast across the sea. It's a really, really long migration. And here is actually some images that your text added this year that illustrates a couple of, I believe these Now I'm trying to remember whether these are individual, whether this is just an individual or not. Multiple trips. I'm not sure. I think that these are just for that these are recordings, travel recordings for just an individual, because you know, when a bird gets big enough, you can actually put satellite trackers on them and track these sorts of things. But anyway, you can see just how extensive this migration is. And you know, for this bird, it's flip-flopping poles basically in order to keep up with the better climate, because you know the seasons flip when you cross hemispheres. Yes.
Can you tag a hummingbird or is it too small? Like with like a tracker or something?
No, believe me, every time somebody tries to sell me that kind of thing, I said, when you give me something that I can put on a 3-gram bird and send it to a satellite, you let me know.
Yeah. I was gonna
Yeah.
say.
When you have a migration that's that long, like how long would that take? Because it almost seems like they would be migrating for longer than they'd actually be breeding.
Actually, that may very well be true.
Okay.
I honestly don't know how long. This is winter down here. Breeding is going to occur up north. I honestly don't know how long the trek takes them. That's a good question.
Probably a while.
It probably does. Well, you know, if you were going to go out and run 25,000 kilometers, that would take you a while.
Yeah.
Yeah. But you know, these guys, they feed, I mean, they feed at sea. So, you know, they always have access, pretty much always have access to food. So, and I imagine that these routes are tuned in order to kind of keep them in a place where food's going to be available at various times a year. And then you remember they're turned, so they have high-speed wings. And so, you know, being able to fly and fly relatively quickly in order to get your lift production up is, you know, it's probably a good thing. These are not birds that just kind of sit in a place. They're in the air most of the time anyway. Yes, Maddie.
So like, why do they migrate from pole to pole? Like if they can kind of feed along the whole way because they're feeding off that.
Well, because the food availability probably is going to be seasonal at one of the poles, you know, and so they stayed in one place. My guess is that during the time of year when they're breeding, they want to be someplace where it's warm enough where breeding is going to be successful, and where there will still be, it'll be warm enough where there will be some sort of a food boom for them. That probably isn't something that is sustainable year round at just one pole, and that would be the only explanation for doing this, as far as I know.
Yeah.
Here's another fun story: blackpoll warblers. Okay, I've seen these birds up in Canada. It has generally been assumed that when they start their southward migration, that they would, you know, they breed up here in the north, and then they just kind of go out to sea and drop straight down to South America. And it was assumed that this required 86 consecutive hours of flight for a little warbler. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. With elliptical wings, so it has to flap all the time. Okay. Now, this got brought into question because a fellow by the name of Murray, back in 1989, my first year teaching at this institution, he published a paper where he suggested that, yeah, they probably don't really do this. They probably stay on land until they get down to the southeastern portion of the United States, and then they go out to sea and head down to South America. Okay. It doesn't really matter. You know, flying that far over the ocean is still pretty impressive for a little guy. Okay. But this bird has been studied a little bit more since Murray did his work, and using using radar and some other means of tracking, probably, well, I don't know what they would use to track a warbler because they're not very big either. But radar actually, and I'll show you an example of this in a slide or two, is a major tool in tracking bird migrations. And what they have found, there's a lot of birds that basically jump off, up around Cape Cod, get out to the ocean, and travel south. And what they think is happening is that the birds are catching trade winds when they get out over the ocean and literally being blown down to South America. So they're saving a huge amount of energy with regard to the cost of flight. And evidence, another bit of evidence for this. So this is the route that they have tracked for the black-polled warbler. So when they're coming south, they just do it all over the water and are blown south. But when they're going north, they take a totally different route. They go from South America, hop into Cuba, up into Florida, and then migrate up the coast. And in some ways, this is actually a little bit unusual, because a point that I will make a little bit later is that when birds are going north to their breeding grounds, that is generally a faster migration than when they're coming south. And this is kind of opposite of that. And the reason that birds will migrate more quickly north, because the faster they get north, the faster they get to their breeding grounds, and the faster they have access to all that food. So, this is a little bit unusual in that regard, but it would make sense if they're catching some energetic advantage because they're being blown to South America, then they wouldn't be experiencing that going north. And so it would make more sense that they would take a route that they were going to be over land more often. Okay. And so this says northern spring migrations tends to be more leisurely. I don't know that leisurely is the right way. It just tends to be more landlocked. Okay, if you ever can make it to, like southern Texas or Louisiana, down in there somewhere, during the month of April, what you need to do is get your own cold beverage, your students, so I won't say pina colada, your lawn chair, and find a good tree that's just right on the edge of the water to sit in. Because a lot of birds will migrate, they will cross the Gulf. And this is going to be true of any bird species that has to migrate over a large barrier, like a large body of water. Okay, they will fly over this large body of water, they will get really tired, and then they get exhausted, and then they become grounded. And this is a phenomenon that's known as fallout. So neotropical migrants, okay, like warblers, vireos, okay, some tanagers, okay, they will fall out on the coast of Louisiana and Texas after crossing the Gulf, usually in April. And it is not unusual to see, and I've heard numbers up around 13, 14 species of birds in a tree at one time, because they're so tired they just plop on the first tree that they find when they get over land. So if you really want to get your life list up, spring break in Louisiana, there you go. Okay, Michelle, now we're coming to your question. So there are some migratory patterns that do not follow seasons. Okay. Instead, they're what we call facultative or flexible. And these are largely adjustments that are made to food availability. And so these types of migrations are termed eruptive. They happen when they need to happen. And I'll give you an example with snowy owls here in a bit. There are examples of populations that exhibit partial migration. And this is not different populations of the same species. This is the same population of birds where some of them are migratory and some of them are not. And partial migration falls into two basic categories. It can be obligate partial migration. And what this means is that, is my daily spam call? Yeah. That's probably the one downside of having an Apple Watch. Anyway, obligate partial migration is a case where you have some members of your population that are genetically inclined to migrate and others that are not. Okay, some do, some go, and some don't. European robin is an example of this. The second category of partial migration is facultative partial migration. This occurs when some individuals must migrate because there's limitations in the environment. So in other words, the environment can only hold so many individuals. And so if you have this boom year of reproduction, and you have more individuals than the environment can support, then you will get this facultative partial migration where birds will disperse to someplace else. And I use the term migration perhaps a little loosely here because it's also possible that there will not be a return migration in these birds. You know, if they find a place to land, there may not be, these birds are kind of forced to leave. They're not necessarily genetically inclined to leave. One example of this occurred, oh goodness, I want to say 10 or 12 years ago, where we had this major explosion of mountain chickadees down here in the valley. That's just, I've never seen it, never saw it before, and I've never seen it again. And mountain chickadees just must have done really, really good that year because they just flooded the valley. It was really weird. Okay, so here's the example of the snowy owl. Snowy owls, you know, they tend to have a fairly northern distribution, but in years where food is scarce, so, you know, there just aren't enough lemmings for them to feed on, then they will move farther south, and that includes here in Oregon. There are some years where we get a whole bunch of sightings of snowy owls. I mean, we've seen them in the class. We saw them at Basket Slough once, where a snowy owl will come south, some years in bigger numbers than in others, basically to find food, and that's sort of an eruptive migration. Yeah.
So when they don't do this migration farther south, they're resident birds, like
Yes.
they don't normally migrate south.
Yeah, and these are birds that will go back too.
Okay.
They will come down here basically to hopefully do a little better finding food, and then when it's time, they'll go back up north.
Okay.
And so these are you know, this is a type of an eruptive migration. So did that answer your question? Cool. All right, ways of tracking migrations. There's a lot of methods and tools that are used to study migration. Probably one of the older methods is through bird banding. So you catch birds, you stick bands on their legs like you see here on scrub jay. And then you trap birds in various locations, and once they have a band on them, you can identify individuals. Records are kept by a federal agency, the Bird Banding Laboratory. And this has helped us to kind of get a handle on migration routes for specific species. A newer technology that is emerging, and I honestly do believe will replace bird banding one of these days, although it's a lot more expensive to engage in, is by giving birds RFID tags, pit tags. I mean, you all pit tagged your dogs, right? And maybe your cats. It's the same technology. You know, you wave a magic wand over them, and this magic number pops out and tells you get in, and it's a unique identifier for the organism. Ken Welch, who teaches at University of Toronto Scarborough, did a study, and I'll show you some data in the next slide for this, where he actually pit tagged ruby-throated hummingbirds. He'd be the first to admit that this is a real challenge for to do on a 3-gram bird. But this is an antenna. The bird just sticks its head through to feed, and he gets a unique identifier for the bird. Lisa Tell, who is an academic veterinarian at UC Davis, she routinely pit tags Anna's hummingbirds, which are 4.5 grams. And she has stopped banding altogether because now she can just track these individuals by having an antenna near where they feed and doesn't need to even touch them anymore. Yes.
Okay, so this is like kind of a sidetrack, but also really related. So I was watching a documentary about where this really cool researcher who does a lot of computer science stuff is developing software to recognize like differences in pig faces to like recognize them. And so it'll like track their growth and development. It can literally like identify specific pigs in like a giant group of pigs. Do you think that like eventually they could have technology where they can differentiate the birds based on that using facial recognition?
My first question would be, why pigs and not like
For people.
Labrador retrievers?
For people, actually, like they're doing pigs first and then they're gonna like.
Anyway, I'm teasing.
Oh.
Anyway, perhaps. You know, when I've done research on birds, when I'm working in a population, it actually is pretty easy to learn to recognize individual birds over time. When I was doing my master's degree and I was watching territorial Annas, you know, every day, I knew who was who just because of the uniquenesses in their own, you know, feather structure, morphology, and, you know.
Okay.
So, sure. You know, you would need to have cameras and all that kind of stuff because, you know, RFID tags, one of the nice things about them is you don't have to be there.
Yeah.
So, because that just all that just gets dumped into into a data recording device. Radar, okay? Radar can track movements of large groups of birds. And so this right here is a radar image of a huge group of birds that are migrating at night from Cuba up to Florida. And radar has been around a long time, and it's actually been used to track large groups of migratory birds for 50 years. So radar is not a new technology, actually. And it's been an important tool in monitoring the decline of migratory species. Here's a data from Ken's study, and I'll show you this just as much to show you what the pit tag looks like. It's 7 millimeters long. So you can imagine even 7 millimeters is a lot to stick in a little 3-gram bird. But this is just a cartoon diagram of the setup that I showed you in the previous page. And what he was doing with these is he was tracking fat deposition in ruby-throated hummingbirds in preparation for their southward migration. Because he's up in Canada, that's where they're going up there to breed. And then when they're getting ready to head south, so days before migration, so the day that they left, and so he was tracking them a couple weeks before, and you can see this exponential increase in mass. And he's tracking individuals because he has a unique identifier on them now. So when they come to a feeder, they perch on a little beam that's attached to a balance. So he gets their mass measurement at the same time that they're coming in to feed, and he gets their identifier so he knows who it is and how much they weigh, and so it allows him to generate these plots. Another example, this one I already showed you another example of, but this is kind of fun. It's been around for a while. This here is just another example of satellite tracking a migratory bird. This is a young osprey. They called him Jaws for whatever reason. And they just tracked his movement from Martha's Vineyard up here in the northeastern part of the US, all the way down to South America. And again, they just strapped a transmitter onto the bird and then were able to just track his movements from some desk somewhere, you know, in a computer. Okay, So departure and arrival dates are timed fairly precisely for many species. This is pretty much a review slide, so I won't spend a lot of time with this. These are things that I probably could even take this slide out that I talked about in the last chapter. It's a consequence of the change from the 3rd edition to the 4th edition of the textbook, but it just reviews a lot of the stuff that we talked about in terms of endocrine control migration, that even cage passerines experience Zuganru and so forth. We're all good with this, right?
Yeah.
This is just a plot that shows the difference between a resident species and a migratory species with regard to mass gain. You see a little bump here for molt, but pretty much mass stays constant across the rest of the annual cycle for a resident species. But then you see body mass takes this huge increase just prior to migration in a migratory species. Last thing, and then I'll be done after this and we'll finish with this example here. The cliff swallows in California. Okay, so every March, the cliff swallows arrive at the mission San Juan Capistrano, and they hold a big festival for it every year. And this is just an example of just how precisely timed migrations are for species. And it may shift days or so, depending, on what's going on with the birds, but this has happened like clockwork as long as I can remember. And it's something when I was a youngster in California, we'd actually go to the festival occasionally. So, and I'll stop there because I'm out of time. Any questions? We will finish this chapter on Thursday. When we will be done with our exam content. I get to talk about navigation, which is a lot of fun.
Ready to work on. Okay.
Yeah.
Feeling that